Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
3, 2, 1, and we are recording. Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California. Today, Bob is off on assignment, but we have an exciting episode for you. We're actually joined by Eugene Puryear, who is a journalist, activist, politician, and host of Breakthrough News. He's a founding member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and he's also the author of Shackled and Chained, Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America. Eugene, welcome to the Green and Red podcast.
Scott, thanks so much for having me, man. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, we're pretty excited to have you here. Maybe we could, we're recording this Monday, September 23rd, and a lot of things have happened over the weekend and late last week. So maybe we can actually just start with a little bit of current events and just get your thoughts on that. Last week in Lebanon, there was this horrific pager attack. Pagers and walkie-talkies where explosive devices were in them. Over the weekend, the Israelis escalated with bombing in southern Lebanon and Syria. I believe at least 180 have been killed. The Al Jazeera office in the West Bank was raided and closed. Senior Hezbollah commanders assassinated. It definitely seems like the Israelis are trying to escalate. I'd just like to get some quick thoughts from you on that.
I think it's, the point you're making about escalation is correct. I mean, they've actually called it de-escalation through escalation, which amazingly the U.S. government said they also agreed with. So we're in sort of Orwellian territory. I think what it really comes down to is terrorism, bludgeoning, bullying. I think the Israeli attitude here, which is not too dissimilar from the apartheid South African regime and how they dealt with the frontline states, is to see if they can deal enough violent blows in Lebanon and Syria, obviously the ongoing genocide in Gaza, to get the various resistance forces to just totally capitulate to Israeli dictates for the region. Now, doesn't seem like that's succeeding, certainly vis-a-vis the North. Hezbollah is, continuing to fire its rockets despite all of the air attacks, despite the pager attack. But to me, that seems like that's what's at the base here, is that the Israeli government has decided they have their own plan, and it's a stated plan by the Likud party, the leadership party, and others, of from the river to the sea, in their view, a totally ethnically cleansed historic Palestine that is totally occupied by the Israelis, and where there's no form of Palestinian government or self-determination even possible, and where all the regional countries totally acquiesce to that. But that, of course, requires them to push extreme violence. And I think that's what they're doing right now in Lebanon. So it's yet to be seen if it turns into a full-scale war, quote unquote. But I think we should expect to see, a continued attempt of these sort of terroristic bullying attempts to force Hezbollah and by extension, I think, anyone who would resist U.S.-Israeli dictates into submission.
And do you think that Netanyahu is also trying to send a message to at least Kamala Harris? I mean, it seems like Trump has bought in on all the escalation, but do you think he's trying to send a message to Kamala Harris as well?
I think he is, if he's not trying to send a message to her, he's certainly trying to make sure that she's, grandfathered in, if you will, if she was able to win the election, by deepening the conflict to such a degree where the U.S. is essentially forced. I mean, not forced. I mean, I think they're willingly in many ways backing Israel, but let's say they didn't want to. They're already so ideologically into backing Israel in all ways. The more the war expands regionally, the more the U.S. will be compelled to, use more of its capabilities than it already is in the defense of Israel against Hezbollah, whoever it may be. We saw that with the Iranian drones, the 3,000 drones. They never could have stopped them without the United States. So I think by trying to deepen the conflict, by engaging further in the north with Lebanon, by, ratcheting things up as it concerns Syria, by stirring the pot in the whole region, which includes Iraq, Yemen, Egypt and Jordan even, that it creates sort of a quote unquote facts on the ground, as the Israelis love to say, that I think they hope will make it very difficult for a Harris administration, if it would, which it's given no indication it will, decide it wanted to change course to some degree from where Biden has been.
And Breakthrough News, part of your mission is also reporting, media from people's movements, and we've seen a lot of active people's movements in the U.S. We saw the occupations on campuses. We see a lot of protests. Here in the Bay Area, for example, we target corporate war profiteers as well as local politicians. And, how do you see, the movement on the U.S., especially this fall, like sort of like kind of playing into this? Or there's like definitely where the Harris campaign seems very concerned about the peeling away of votes. I've actually seen polls in states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Arizona where Jill Stein actually polls better with Muslim voters than Trump or Harris. And I'm kind of curious how you see the sort of movement politics playing into this. People's movement politics, just to be clear.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that people's movements and the movement that has, specifically erupted in opposition to the genocide in Gaza could end up being the key issue here now in the US election. And I think a lot of people who have been out protesting in the hundreds of thousands, I mean, we'd have to add it all up, but I think millions of people have been protesting for the last 10 months. I think many of those people have now turned their attention to the election and they want to deal a blow. I think certainly in the Arab and Muslim community, that's the direct conversation. I mean, we had the opportunity to speak at Breakthrough News with some of the leadership of Abandon Harris, which was previously Abandon Biden. And the point that they were making is that a genocide is of such great import that it's absolutely critical to draw a line that if you push this forward, your political career will be sunk. Either political party, certainly the Democrats who claim to be, in favor of many of these various causes, whether they are or not is a different question. So I think when you look at the polls done by CARE, if you look at which is the Council on American Islamic Relations, if you look at the polls that are done by the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, you can absolutely see that Jill Stein in the Arab and Muslim community is ahead or tied with Kamala Harris. And you look at states like Michigan, which we all know, but also states like, say, Georgia, for instance, which have a not insignificant population of Arab and Muslim people, and where there have also been, beyond just the Arab and Muslim community, large protests that have been taking place. I think Virginia is a state which is like maybe not a swing state, but potentially because of the way things are playing this year, could play out there. I think there's a number of other states that we could say this. And I think this is in many ways a culmination of the movement politics, because there's been every possible form of opposition you can imagine, from the Golden Gate Bridge being shut down to the Brooklyn Bridge being shut down to 100,000 people on the street, or 500,000 people on the streets of DC multiple different times, every small town, the campuses, and yet the occupation still continues. And I think many people are feeling that the only leverage they have left is to actually try to deliver a political blow to the Democratic Party as a form of punishment, and that perhaps that can reset the agenda and the politics of the status quo. And I think that's encouraging because it shows that people are believing in their own agency and looking to take back the power for themselves and are not just waiting for someone on high to deliver something based on some vague promise.
Yeah, I would actually say one of the things that we've been arguing on our show when we've done a lot of coverage of Palestine and Gaza and movements in the U.S. is that one of the reasons that Biden dropped out is that the movements here, particularly the campus occupations, but everything has basically pointed out the weakness of Biden, which actually eventually led to his downfall.
I think that is very, very true. I mean, I think that it was sort of the bleeding edge of the wide range of disappointment that existed with Biden, and I think the Democrats more specifically. And I think one of the things that we have to remember is that Biden sort of started off with a big disappointment. He came out with Build Back Better, which, was a basic reform program, but certainly much more than what the Democrats have been offering in their neoliberal era in terms of expanding social programs, rights for working class people, oppressed people, and so on and so forth. And then he's sabotaged by the Democrats, by his own party, that the Mansions and others that don't do it. I think it was a bad nightmare back to the first 2 years of the Obama administration where they said we can't have health care or union rights or anything like that because of Joe Lieberman and individuals of the similar ilk. And I think people who have been coming to the forefront in that time, that, obviously in the context of the presidents we've seen from Obama to Trump to Biden, but also in context of the movements we've seen, people want to see more significant change. I mean, you had the New York Times poll that said roughly 70% of people wanted the economy to either be drastically changed or completely torn down. And I think that Gaza was such an open soar. It was I mean, beyond everything else that the Democrats had failed to deliver on domestically, foreign policy wise, the Iran deal, the blockade on Cuba, like all these other things, then they actually back a genocide against
Right.
the Palestinian people. And I think for so many, it was like this was the encapsulation of why Biden could no longer be supported. And I think we've seen just his pure replacement by Kamala Harris, who is not the world's most popular politician, in and of itself, created new enthusiasm because there was such, anger, frustration, lethargy. So yes, I agree with that assessment is that they had to replace Biden. And a lot of what that was about really was the fact that this movement in solidarity with the people of Palestine had just, revealed and opened up not just anger over that, but made it indicative of anger over the broad inability of Biden to deliver to the extent he promised he would in 2020.
Not only that, it seems like Kamala, but we're going off on this tangent, but we're always happy to talk about this. It seems like Kamala Harris actually is more to the right than Biden in many ways. I completely agree with everything you're saying, but like just this Wall Street Journal article I saw over the weekend where she is much more open and communicative with corporate CEOs. Actually, in this Wall Street Journal, article talks a lot about her, growing relationship with Jamie Dimon, for example, who's the CEO of Chase Bank, and it seems like she's even further to the right, at least particularly on economic issues and neoliberalism than Biden.
Yeah, I mean, here's a good way to look at that. When she made her adjustment to her decision to say she wanted to raise the capital gains rate from what it is now, which is, I believe, 21% to 28%, which was less than what Biden had proposed, which is to raise it to the same level as the income tax, right? So that if you're making money in the stock market, you don't get a bonus essentially for, in terms of your taxes. She chose 28%, which to me was interesting because Ronald Reagan pegged the capital gains rate at 28% as a part of his big rollback of taxes during his administration. So, you got the Harris administration on taxation policy right in the Goldilocks zone of Ronald Reagan, but we've seen it consistently on a range of different issues. I mean, we saw Governor Wes Moore, who is the governor of Maryland, a major surrogate, say that he thought that Kamala Harris would be less aggressive towards corporations at the FCC, at the SEC level. We saw Jim Messina, the top Democratic person, say something, one of the top Democratic advisors say something similar recently. She's reached out even to the cryptocurrency industry, which has been one of the main forces combining, by the way, with the Zionist lobby to target people like Cori Bush. The actually Fair Shake is the crypto PAC, the largest PAC in the country right now, spending a lot of it taking on so-called progressive Democrats in different ways. She's reaching out to Coinbase. She's reaching out to Ripple. So even sort of in that area that's considered very pro-Trump. She's got big supporters, in the biggest mergers and acquisition firms. And then, of course, on the border, she's she's deliberately running to the right of Trump in order to try to seem tough on the border. Yeah, there's so many different points and so many different issues. And I think there's maybe a range of reasons for that. But I think the most important thing that it shows is that Kamala Harris views the most important voter base for this election not to be, the broad base of Democratic Party voters, and certainly not anyone to the left of the Democrats, but in to be sort of center right, soft Republicans, Joe Manchin style Democrats who tend to live in the suburban areas around the major cities in many of the different swing states that can, sort of go either way. So rather than try to mobilize your max base mobilization, which means you probably want to go a little bit more progressive, it seems that she's really trying to steal an element of the Republican base and try to, heavily rest her hat, as it were, on the most conservative Democrats, which I think does not bode well for her as a president, moving anywhere but, more to the right.
Right. And, white suburbanites or even like, a diverse coalition of suburbanites is definitely who they're appealing to. It's also, what also like a sort of big indicator for that for me is the endorsements that they're getting from former Reagan officials, former Daddy Bush officials, W. Bush officials, Trump officials, Liz Cheney. It's definitely the sort of signaling to those voters.
No, I think that's a great point. I mean, if Dick Cheney is endorsing you, you have to assume right there you've done something wrong. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the most, a huge war criminal, one of the most right-wing politicians over the various years. But again, it speaks to the point you're making. It speaks to the point I was just making that ultimately, if they want these people to feel comfortable with the Kamala Harris presidency. And it reminds me of something that Biden said in the 2020 campaign that went viral, that he said to a group of high dollar donors that whatever you think about my policies, whether you like them or whether you don't like them, for you, the richest, the most elite, the 1%, nothing will fundamentally change. And I think that is the image that Kamala Harris wants to give to the people who we all know control politics, the billionaires, the elite, the ruling class, whatever we want to call them, that like, okay, I'm going to say some things, I'm going to do some things. It's an election. You know how that goes. But at the end of the day, you can rest assured that nothing will fundamentally change.
I'm gonna change topic just a little bit with some of the talks you've given recently and some of the stuff you've written. Uh, I listened to a talk that you gave recently on alternative radio called "From Birmingham to Bethlehem," and talking about the connections between the Palestinian struggle for freedom and dignity, how it can take lessons from the Black liberation movement. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate the question because this is such a huge issue. And it's been a major issue. I mean, there was a poll that came out earlier this year that said 1 in 6 Black Americans were considering not voting. And one of the main reasons why was defense of the Palestinian people. So this is a wide running thing. I would encourage people also to go back. I rarely recommend the New York Times, but to read both of Charles Blow's editorials from earlier this year about young Black voters in Palestine and how many younger Black voters were saying at that time it was Biden. But, speaking about the visceral nature of this connection, which for so many of us, I'm only 38, but people my age and younger, is connected to Ferguson and the fact that it was Palestinians who came onto social media and were telling, strugglers in the streets of Ferguson how to fight through tear gas. That was the same tear gas being used in Palestine and in the streets there. But of course, it's the renewal of this significant long-term push that was, really in many ways inaugurated by Malcolm X in a modern sense. He traveled to Gaza in 1964. He met with the leadership of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And really, it was his stewardship of trying to build those bridges that led to bridges being built by Ethel Miner, one of his aides, with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, that then became a major voice in the 1967 war in solidarity with Palestine. And then the rise of the Black Panthers, the Black Power movement, the radical subset of the Black Liberation Movement, Republic of New Africa, the African Liberation Day protests. Solidarity with Palestine became fundamental. I mean, one, because you had Black Americans who I rightfully, in my view, viewed themselves as an oppressed people and thus could see a relationship between the Palestinians as an oppressed people, but also recognizing that around the world, in the areas where the African diaspora or on the African continent and issues the African diaspora was concerned with apartheid and colonization, that Israel was one of the number one supporters of apartheid and other regimes like that. And it created a widespread, wide-ranging that by the early 1980s, the most mainstream sections of Black American political opinion were looking to express solidarity with the Palestinian people because they were looking to use that as a signal and as a sign to the broad mass of Black people who they were calling on for votes, for money, for support, for their organizations or their political campaigns, that they were in tune with the politics of the Black community. Like Palestine became a way to show you are in tune with this history of Malcolm X, of the Black Panthers, of Kwame Ture, of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, of June Jordan, of all these different people. This was your way to signal that. And I think that this is something that has been renewed in our recent period. And we're seeing a lot of this play out in our current politics when we're seeing how Cori Bush, for instance, heavily targeted for her positions in favor of Palestine. Jamal Bowman, who quite frankly, was even kind of like a soft supporter of Israel, but even that was too much, for the Zionist lobby, and he also was targeted. So it seems very clear, I think, for we look at that continuum, that Zionists in America, the supporters of Israel, are fully aware not only of this history, but of the moral authority of the Black liberation movement that has helped catalyze the Palestinian solidarity movement by associating quote unquote Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black lives, with the movement for Palestinian freedom and self-determination, and that actually can drive many non-Black people, many non-Arab and Muslim people into the corner and into the camp of Palestine.
Yeah, it seems like after 2020 is when I started seeing a lot more street action around Palestine, actually often led by people who are associated with Black Lives Matter. I remember in May 2021 when the Israelis were, um, raiding and harassing I can't remember the name of the neighborhood right now, but near Jerusalem, is that we
Yeah,
started seeing like say it again.
Sheikh Jarrah.
Yeah, Sheikh Jarrah. We started seeing like a lot of street action in the U.S. in support of the Palestinian struggle.
Yeah, that's 100% true. And, even we remember Rifat al-Arir, many people who have seen the Palestinian poet who was assassinated in Gaza. He was the co-founder of a group called We Are Not Numbers. And they put up a giant, beautiful mural of George Floyd on the apartheid wall and, consistently showed solidarity with Black liberation struggles. And we saw in the 2020 period and the post-2020 period into 2021 that this is a real connection. I mean, it's not small. And I mean, it goes from, even mainstream groups. I mean, we're talking about this year, the NAACP and the African Methodist Episcopal Church, two of the most mainstream groups in the Black community, calling not just for a ceasefire, but for an arms embargo. And so that really, I think, is also a reflection of how deep the street actions, the organizing, the political education has been among especially Black young people around the issue of Palestine and how it really has made it a mainstream issue in Black America.
Do you think that we've also seen labor actually take some unprecedented steps around Gaza, and this year about half of the organized unions representing about half of organized labor have actually come out and called for a ceasefire. Do you think that's influenced by what's happened since 2020, or do you think that is some different factors at play there?
I think it's twofold. I do think it is influenced by what's happened since 2020 because I do feel a lot of younger workers, and I think this is what we're seeing at the conventions and where these things are coming up. Whether we're talking about the UAW, whether we're talking about SEIU, whether we're talking about APWU, whether you're a postal worker inside of the building, whether you are working at Waffle House, whether you are, to some degree involved in your union and a grad student, or if you're an auto worker, a young auto worker. People have been affected by these things that have been happening since 2020. They've been involved in the things that have been happening since 2020. In certain states like Michigan, of course, where the auto workers are so strong, you have a lot of Arab auto workers who are talking to their friends and coworkers as well. So I think you have a mix of these various factors, but I very much think, and what I've heard and what I've been able to glean from people in the labor movement, this has been a major factor, is that labor leaders are seeing that younger workers want to see their unions speak out on this issue because they recognize, not only how unjust it is, but they have been a part of a broader stream in the past several years that have brought together a lot of these economic and racial justice issues with issues like self-determination for the Palestinian people.
Yeah, and just a tangent is that I do a lot of my work in the environmental and climate movement space, and we've seen a lot of younger climate activists basically also wanting climate organizations and climate movement folks to be actually more outspoken and more taking more action on Palestine, which with the more mainstream groups, we've seen a lot of resistance to that. They're just like quiet on it, right? Unless there's some, even with the campus uprisings, we didn't actually see a lot of speaking out from like some of the more mainstream environmental groups.
No, I think that's a good point. And one quick just corollary I'd
also, they're very tied to the Democrats too, those mainstream
Yes.
environments. I just want to point that out too.
No, for sure. And I mean, and it speaks to a greater question. I mean, and one I just want to note quickly, the Union for Southern Service Workers, which is like low wage workers at like Family Dollar and Waffle House, they actually marched to the student encampment at UNC as part of their May Day demonstration, which shows how some of this is coming together. But I think the point you're making about the environmental groups is big because, I mean, the difference with unions in a way is, and churches for that matter, we talk about the AME church, is the money is generated by the people who are members of the institution, right? And I think so many of our organizations, not just in the environmental movement, but in many movements, are operating out of this NGO industrial complex foundation-based world, which is very mainstream, very ruling elite, very tied to the Democrats, very just like, you can rock the boat a little bit, but only within the red lines that we've determined the boat can be rocked. And I think for our social movements moving into 2025, seeing that every single issue, especially the climate, is only getting worse in drastic ways, I think we have to think more seriously about how do we do our grassroots fundraising? I mean, there are many critiques I could make of Bernie Sanders, but it is notable to me that between 2016 and 2020, he raised $400 million in grassroots donations. And so many of us who are struggling, like, we need only a fraction of that to quadruple the actual work we're doing on the ground. So how do we actually start to move to funding models that make it easier for us to take bold stands, I think, is a big question emerging from this situation in Gaza.
Yeah, absolutely. The one last question about this is, you recently penned an article, I think it came out around the time of the DNC, about the 1964 Democratic Convention with the Mississippi Freedom Party. I'm just wondering if you could talk about that for a minute. Just tell us a little bit about some of the, both my co-host and I are both history professors, or he still is, but we don't necessarily like to draw the parallels as much as just the history as a process, when sometimes there is some similarity. But I'm wondering if you could actually just talk a little bit about how you saw what happened in 1964 relating to what was happening in 2024.
Well, it felt so reminiscent, in that article, Battle on the Boardwalk, which you can find at liberationnews.org, was honestly like...
And we'll put it in the show notes.
Yes, thank you. I wrote it before actually what happened with Uncommitted. So it was honestly wild to watch what was happening at the convention after having written the article, but it felt very similar in the sense that you basically had you had this similar issue of a presidential candidate who was trying to capitalize on a political moment that in many ways had a very sort of progressive cast to it. I mean, obviously the Democrats don't have a very progressive agenda, but I think most people who want to confront Trump, right, are looking to confront the right, to move the country in a different direction, so on and so forth. But where you don't want anything that can actually be outside the message to expose how your agenda is not exactly what you want people to think it is and the vibes you want to exude. And thus you have to, cleanse the convention of any of the voices that could be coming from the grassroots. So, of course, in Mississippi, you had this in 1964, you had the issue of the so-called Mississippi regulars. They knew without a doubt that most of the voters in the South were probably not going to go with Johnson, but they figured they could hold some of them maybe in that election. So they didn't want to seem to be too hard on the segregationists because they thought maybe we can find a way to work it. And here we are in 2024. They know that in general, a lot of people who are very aggressively in favor of Israel will probably and are gravitating a little bit more to the Republicans, but they don't want to lose those sort of pro-genocide forces totally if they can keep some of them that tend to be more liberals on side. So again, they had to make sure there was no messaging that could potentially disrupt the vibes they were putting out by actually putting facts on the table or opening up contradictions in the stance of the administration towards in 64 civil rights, and in this case, the Palestinian issue, in order to make sure that they could have the right message they wanted to put forward. Now, I think the difference is, in many ways, the Mississippi Freedom Democrats were much more determined to disrupt the process than the uncommitted movement. No disrespect. But, I thought a lot of what happened there in Chicago, they were sort of begging to be put forward, where in, 1964, they weren't really begging, they were demanding. And in fact, they actually ran onto the floor and tried to seize the area and were removed by the police when they weren't seated. So I think there's some differences there that I think go to maybe some of the differences in how both things arose. But I think in general, it's the same basic thing, as it was an inconvenient truth in both years to have civil rights or Palestinian solidarity injected into a milieu where they want to perceive themselves as progressive. They want people to think this is a big progressive movement, but they don't want any issue coming from the grassroots that could disrupt the vibes with the real narrative.
The vibes, exactly. I'm gonna switch topics again. And so, besides working with Breakthrough News, you're also a founder of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. You actually mentioned Bernie Sanders before, who's a democratic socialist, but in many ways he's just a Democrat, like a LBJ era Democrat in many ways. But we've also seen, at least with polling and with the enthusiasm we see from a kind of more center left base, we see a lot of young people and probably older people who say capitalism's a problem, who identify more as socialists, identify more as communist or anarchist. And I'm wondering how you find how is it this is the right perspective. How is this how is this sort of shift happening? And we see institutions continue to move to the right, like the Democrats and Kamala Harris, what we've been talking about. But there's a lot of propaganda within the media, from the government and things like that, which are very anti-communist. Like the Republicans in particular talk about it, but the Democrats do as well, just attack their enemies as socialists. And I'm wondering, how you see this coming about. How has this happened? How have we seen like a sort of base of people move more to the left while institutions are moving more to the right? That's a long, convoluted question. It was a little bit on the fly, so.
Yeah, no, it's all good. And I think it's a great question. I mean, I personally think that it's the inability of anyone in the ruling elite, however we call it, to propose solutions that meet the scale of the problem. So people are just seeing in front of their face things that obviously should be solvable. Like, for instance, the fact that we have in every major city and many minor cities a homelessness crisis, but there are, many, many times more the number of empty dwellings than there are homeless people. But of course, since people own those empty dwellings, you can't just move homeless people in there. And I think the corollary to that is also the affordable housing crisis that we're seeing around the country in almost every place. Whether with the environment, I mean, you would think that there would be no issue that would be more pressing than the survival of humanity as a species on the planet Earth. Like, it seems like, can you get any more serious and important than that? And yet, and still, the level of urgency and the level of action is so low, while the actual from the wildfires to the floods to, the just increasing hurricanes. I mean, everything that we see happening here as it regards climate change and everything that's coming from it, is only getting worse in that context. I think you look at the issues around policing and the criminal justice system that have led to so many uprisings. Like, we're in 2024, and somehow it still seems to be too much to ask for Black people to not just be summarily executed in the street with no justice whatsoever. So I think people are starting to put together these pieces. And despite all the propaganda and despite everything that's been said, despite the contested histories of the past, as it concerns socialism, communism, anarchism, whatever, I think people are saying, listen, we have to try something different than capitalism. We have to start looking beyond capitalism. We have to start looking for more, sort of people first rather than profit first types of strategies. And so now we're seeing millions of people, I mean, by my own account, looking at a very variety of different polls, so this is just back of the envelope, at least 15 million people in this country view themselves solidly now as socialist and communist. I think, unfortunately, different things aren't polled, but anarchists also would add to that, and a substantial people who call themselves anarcho-syndicalists. People are looking at it all.
Anarchists probably wouldn't participate in the polls. So
exactly.
As an anarchist, I feel like I can say that safely.
Exactly. But I think people are just looking for answers wherever they can find them, and they're looking for inspiration to pass movements. And realistically, it's the socialists, the communists, the anarchists, the syndicalists. Like, when we look back in history, like, who really stepped up in the toughest times and fought the hardest, you keep coming back to that. And I think as people are doing their own searching online through books, they're also seeing that. So I think it's a result of that. And plus the social movements that have also broadly disseminated more political education around a lot of these issues, I think has played obviously a key catalytic role. But I think it's just people are seeing more and more like, wait a second, like, if we keep going this way, we're going to die. Like, our Earth is going to be destroyed. Our lives are going to be nothing. And it's not worth it for just a handful of people, less than 1%, to be benefiting.
Yeah. And I mentioned this about Trump, Trump's response to even like, center-right Democrats, as they call them, radical socialists. The Democrats are very known for punching left, even on people who aren't even really that left, like the AOCs and the Bernie Sanders. And so, how do you see this current iteration of a Red Scare sort of playing out and playing into this?
I feel, and I've been trying to write and talk about this a lot, we are entering another, we have McCarthyism, but you also have the Little Red Scare that happened after World War I. I mean, we could talk about the panics that would, ensue around slave revolts. I mean, we are in a situation here where I think that the Democrats and the Republicans, obviously, but like, you can expect it from the Republicans, but the Democrats are just as invested with closing down space to the political left. I mean, first and foremost, you have this sort of smear campaign that Republicans and Democrats themselves are both engaging in conjunction with the state security forces, the so-called intelligence community, saying that everyone who's against the status quo on U.S. foreign policy, that you're controlled by Russia, you're controlled by China, you're controlled by Iran, you're controlled by Hamas, you're controlled by Hezbollah. Sometimes you're controlled by all five of them
North
somehow.
Korea. There's North Korea too.
By the way, North Korea, can't forget that. Anyone they can find, basically, at this point, and throwing that against the wall. But in the context of this misinformation, disinformation, I think it's extraordinarily dangerous because essentially they have formed this unholy alliance with the tech companies in Silicon Valley who have basically said, if to the government, we don't want to be regulated. And if the issue why you want to regulate us is disinformation or misinformation, quote unquote, tell us who you want to ban and we will ban them. And so we're seeing the closing down of the ability to have dissenting voices, on the internet, on social media. Obviously, you're already excluded from mainstream media, which is an attempt to close down political thinking in this country and the possibility of people seeing differences. But I think it's more significant than that. I mean, it's also at the level of the state itself of, you look at a person like a gentleman named Henry Liang, who is a hotel worker in Boston, Chinese American guy who has been charged as a Chinese spy for exchanging a couple text messages about a totally legal event with a low level person at a Chinese consulate. You can see the level that they're going to try to tag people. I also would point to people, even though it's kind of gone out of the news, but look at the rise of critical infrastructure laws, which have been pushed just as much by Democrats as Republicans, which are 100% designed to criminalize serious, nonviolent civil disobedience as it concerns the climate issue as well. And obviously, that's only becoming more significant. So you think about Standing Rock, you think about Line 3, we think about the Mountain Valley Pipeline and all those different sort of pieces. They're trying to make it much more difficult to have nonviolent civil disobedience, in order to protect.
Cop City is another one.
Cop City, 100%, proliferating all across the country. And the Cop City, I'm so glad you raised that because that's a sign that they know that they're actually not going to resolve any of the problems that people are upset about. And so they're increasing the enforcement apparatus. So they've got the ideological element of it, which is to attempt to paint everyone as some evil agent of some terrorist, quote unquote, or foreign power. They've got the police agency, which is just sort of general around it. They're increasing the laws to make it more difficult to protest, mask bans and things like that. So when you pull it all together, it seems very clear to me that there is a bipartisan project to really put the cap on, the possibility of radical movements continuing to grow and emerge in the country, which also means that they think it could happen, which I think is something that, should, even though we got to fight, also make us hopeful.
Yep, absolutely. Just on a personal note, have you received any backlash for your activism or your reporting with Breakthrough?
Oh yeah, I mean,
speaking about those groups, like I know about like It's Going Down and Crime Think have been banned from Twitter and things like that. Have y'all had that sort of pressure or heat?
We've definitely had a lot of heat. So far, we haven't been banned from any social media, but at various different moments, we felt pretty confident we're being suppressed for different reasons. There's been a range of different sort of reports that have been done, all scurrilous, but, from the New York Times to, the Washington Examiner claiming that we're a part of some sort of Chinese Hamas, Hezbollah triangle of evil or something like that we're trying to put this out. Of course, we're not doing anything illegal, so they haven't been able to pin us on it. So they've actually now sort of started this whole new thing that the real threat is groups like Breakthrough News who aren't breaking the law. And so that means that obviously there's loopholes that are allowing people to do this, that, and the third. So, we've seen it. Peter Schweitzer is one of the biggest investigative journalists on the far right wing, has written a ridiculous book about, China controlling America, but, targeted Breakthrough. The New York Times has mentioned us offhand, Washington Examiner, many other right-wing elements. There's this new right-wing research group, the name of which I'm forgetting, that put out a whole long report. So we're seeing that the work we're doing is being challenged. And one of the main things that a lot of these groups have been saying is how much we've been focusing on Palestine since October 7th and how that in and of itself is pernicious. And, we don't know where it will go, but we do know every single tech media giant, all the people who work on their content moderation are former intelligence community people, former Pentagon people. So we see a lot of unexplained blips in terms of how our views can go up and down, things that are taken down, posts that are censored, that lead us to believe that this is not only facing us, but it's going to continue to grow and going to continue to attack all alternative media, because they're obviously scared about whatever the drawbacks of the internet, about the possibilities it has to bring information to people at scale.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess my final question is about Breakthrough News. I will say that during the April, May, June, the campus uprisings, Breakthrough was like my go-to of where the street actions were happening, where the campus actions were happening. But for any of our audience that's not familiar with Breakthrough, even though you're really out there, could you actually just tell our audience a little bit about Breakthrough News?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking too, Scott. I mean, Breakthrough News are about 4 years old, in this May, so it's a pretty new outlet. We had a tagline we kind of dropped that we're the media arm of the movement, as it were, when we first started. But that's kind of our attitude in a way. Is we started this. Some of us are journalists. Some of us, like myself, are not journalists by trade. But we were just sick and tired of so many actions, so many things that we had done, so many issues that we care about being covered, not covered at all, or covered with so little context that it really, just didn't help at all. So we wanted to be able to bring to the forefront the stories that we think need to be heard that aren't heard from people's movements in this country and around the world, and the critical context to understand the issues happening in this country and around the world so that you can be a more informed person. And we always say, and what I always kind of harp on is, all of us in our lives and trying to reach people, you have those people who you just keep trying to talk to them, and you're hitting your head against a wall. And we want our pieces to really be something that people who maybe already are engaged, in addition to people who aren't engaged learning, people who are engaged and maybe do know a little bit something, can use as a tool and can take to someone and say, okay, you're tired of listening to me, well, listen to this, and then let's talk. So that it can also be a force multiplier for our movements and helping not just to inform people who stumble across it, but to allow us to metastasize it out through our organizations, through our activism, through our organizing, as tools to help people understand what is actually going on and to continue to grow our audience. So we've been focusing on every issue we can, really, with a relatively small team in these 4 years, majorly in Palestine. We're pretty easy to find. You can find us at breakthroughnews.org. And then on social media, all the social media, we're at BT Newsroom.
Excellent. That was going to be my next question, where we can find you. I'm gonna wrap it there, folks. We've been talking with Eugene Puryear, who is a journalist and activist, politician, co-host at Breakthrough News. If you like what you're hearing, check Green and Red Podcasts out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. Listen to us on all the audio podcast platforms. And if you really want to support us, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit the support button, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. Eugene, it's been really great having you. This was a great conversation. I'm really excited to have had this with you. And hopefully we can have you back again sometime soon. And
Yeah.
thanks for
yes.
talking to each other. Thanks for coming on, though, and we'll talk to you
thanks
again
so much for having me. And hopefully everyone becomes a patron of this podcast. We have to support alternative media. Please become a patron.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Everyone else out there, make trouble and misbehave, and we'll talk to you again soon.